Okay, so obviously, in order to understand brain injury, we have to understand a little bit about the brain. So I'm going to spend some time talking about how the brain's put together, basic brain anatomy, and a little bit about how brain development happens. So our brain is made up of millions of neurons, okay? And the neurons are the basic information processing pieces in the brain, okay? And they're amazing cells because what they do is they take in information from these processes here. They're called dendrites. They take in information from neurons all over the brain. And they take that information in, and when it gets to the cell body, that cell body has to make a decision about that information, okay? So put that information together and decide what to do with it. So it has to decide, am I going to send that information on to other neurons or not? And if I'm going to send it on, how strong is my signal going to be, and what kind of signal is that going to be? And then that cell sends that information out this long axon and out these terminal branches, either to muscles or other organs in your body or to other neurons. And so neurons can look very different from one another, but they all are characterized by these distinctive processes that allow them to connect with other neurons in very complicated circuits all throughout the brain. And it's those circuits that the work in your brain, the work and the things we do in our daily life, those are the circuits that cause that to happen, are those connections between neurons. And during development, what we see in young children as they're developing is the development of those connections between neurons and the developments of those circuits. And so some of those circuits are kind of hardwired, right? So when you think about infants coming into the world, what are some of the skills that they come in with already that seem to be hardwired? Breathing, what else? Sucking, what else? Crying, crying. Reflexes, they can identify shadows and light, right? So there's some things that are already in there and already programmed in there when infants come into the world. But then there are other circuits that are developed through experience. That experience really shapes how those circuits are created, okay? So that the infant's interaction with the world helps them create circuits that allow them to develop and grow. Okay, so when you think about the infant who can hear sounds when they're born, but very quickly becomes to distinguish their mother's voice as a special sound, right? Because that sound is related to food, hopefully, and related to food and comfort and all of those good things, right? And so that experience helps that baby's brain circuitry develop so that it recognizes its mother's voice. The other thing that happens that we notice in development is actually the removal of brain circuits that aren't working, okay, or aren't needed anymore. So some of those early primitive reflexes that babies have that then go away later are a good example of what's called pruning, where old circuits that aren't working are pruned away, okay? Okay. So all of these circuits and all of these neurons, and in addition, some other cells that offer nutrition and support to those neurons, form your brain, which is this really unimpressive looking kind of 3-pound structure, right? That is the consistency of a Jell-O jiggler, okay? You guys ever make those where you add the juice to the Jell-O, and you shake it and it jiggles. It's got a little substance to it, but it kind of jiggles, and that's kind of the substance of your brain. So it's not a real tough kind of structure, right? And then it's kind of crammed into the brain, or into the skull, and in order to make the most of that space that's allowed, it kind of has all these folds and nooks and crannies to increase the surface area of your brain and maximize space. So you have this structure, and it's in your skull, and it's kind of balanced on the brainstem. So it's kind of like having a soccer ball balanced on a marker, okay? So it's this big 3-pound structure on top of this kind of smaller spinal cord. And in that skull, which protects the brain, there's a hole. And through that hole is where the spinal cord goes, right? And right above that is your brainstem. Right above where that hole is. And your brainstem is where all the things that keep you alive happen. So making sure you breathe and that your heart's still beating and your blood pressure stays stable all happens in that brainstem. okay? And then, in addition to kind of protecting your brain, that skull also kind of supports it. And so there's some places where the brain almost kind of rests in some ways on parts of the skull. And the thing to remember is that have you ever looked at the inside of a skull, like in a skeleton or something? Is it a smooth surface? It's a real rough, craggy surface. There are pieces of bone that kind of stick up from it, so it's not a real comfortable place to rest, right? And so there are places like up here underneath the frontal lobes of your brain and down here underneath what are called the temporal lobes of your brain, that the brain is resting pretty close to these kind of craggy, rocky kind of looking places in your skull. Okay? And so in addition to the skull protecting your brain also has a system of membranes that protect it as well, and that cushion it in kind of a thin layer of fluid. So it's almost kind of floating in this thin layer of fluid. So there's a membrane that's kind of like cellophane, okay? And it covers every nook and cranny very closely to the surface of the brain. And then, and that's right here in the pia mater. And then here's the middle membrane, which is the arachnoid, and it's kind of like a spongy kind of a surface, kind of a membrane. And through that spongy part, fluid flows, okay, which is called cerebral spinal fluid, and that flows through that membrane, offering that kind of watery cushion so that the brain's almost floating. And then the top membrane, the dura mater, is this very thick membrane whose job is to protect, intruders who are coming into the brain. It's a nice tough membrane. So you've got this brain that's kind of floating in this little cushion in this kind of bony, craggy skull. That fluid that surrounds the brain flows. It has a couple of purposes, not just to protect your brain, but also nourishes it. And so it flows through the brain in kind of these are called ventricles, but it's a system that almost is like, if you think about cave systems under the ground, right? Those caverns that water flows through. And so the fluid flows around in those membranes and also through these ventricles and down into the spinal cord and into the membranes that cover the spinal cord, okay? And it's a fluid that is constantly being produced, okay? So the brain is nourished by that fluid, and then it's also nourished by its blood supply, okay? And so the brain has this system of blood vessels that is kind of like a web. It almost looks like fingers if you look at that tries to make sure that every area of the brain receives adequate blood supply so that it can function properly. Okay? So does that all make sense so far? Just kind of as an overview of how the brain's put together. Okay, so when you think about your brain, we often think about it almost like a factory. So you've got a factory, and it has different departments in it, and each department does its job, right? So you might have, let's say it's the crayon factory, because we work at the kids, so why not? And so there's one department that mixes the wax and the pigment, and then there's another department that molds the crayons, and then there's a department that packages them up and labels them, and there's a department that puts them in boxes, and then the shipping department, right? And they each have their job to do. And there certainly is some of that that's true for your brain as well, that there are parts of the brain that are specialized for certain operations, certain things that it should do. But then the other thing that's true is that all of those parts of your brain are connected together in complicated ways. So just like in the factory, if the people mixing the wax start to run low on wax, they got to tell everybody else so they can adjust their production. The same thing is true in the way your brain works. So let's say you're going to pick up your bottle of water or a cup of water in front of you. Think about all the things that are involved in that. First, one part of your brain has to see it, right? And perceive it and say, that's a cup, okay? And kind of figure out what size it is, what shape it is, what size it is. And then another part of your brain has to use that information to say, hey, hand, reach out and grab that cup, and tell you how far you should hold your hand, apart. And then when you lift up that cup, another part of your brain needs to tell you how heavy is it, so you don't end up throwing your cup of water over your head, right? Okay? And so that you can adjust how your motor movement works, okay? And then you take a drink. So that wouldn't be possible if all of those parts of your brain weren't communicating very rapidly and very closely with one another. So the function of each part of your brain is important, but those connections are almost more important. And you'll see why when a kid has an injury, it's critical to think about that. Because a lot of times we can get focused on, well, this kid had this injury to this part of the brain, so he's only going to have problems doing this particular skill. When in actuality, an injury in any part of the brain is going to also disrupt all those connections. And so you might have unintended consequences that you don't expect because of the way those connections are disrupted. So here's just an example of when we divide the brain up into kind of large areas and think about their function, what that looks like. So the back part, the occipital lobe, anyone fresh on their brain anatomy? It's probably been a while for most people, but we usually think about the occipital lobe for as vision, right? Vision, yep, as processing visual information. And the cerebellum, anyone remember what that is? What we usually think about that being focused on? Motion, coordination, balance, yep. And then the temporal lobe. So hearing and visual spatial processing. Yeah. The parietal lobe we usually think of as dealing with sensation. So if you can think back to your undergraduate psychology class where they showed you that homunculus, which is that kind of strange looking person drawn on that part of the brain where our body is represented, the sensations in our body are represented in that portion of your brain. And then there's the frontal lobe, which is where judgment and reasoning and planning and forethought and impulse control and motor coordination all happens, okay? So each of those pieces have a specific part to play. But also, this just kind of gives you an idea of the types of connections that are found in the brain. So some of them are highlighted, but you can kind of see throughout this picture these almost cable-like looking structures, okay? And those are tracks, okay? And those are formed by the axons. Remember that long process that goes out of the neuron? Those axons kind of come together to make these kind of cable-like connections, okay? And so those connections can happen in multiple ways. They can connect to very distant parts of your brain, okay? So that long blue connection kind of shows you how parts at the back of the brain can be connected to parts in the front and everywhere in between. Also, adjacent structures can be connected, if you look at that yellow connection there. And then also, surface areas of your brain can be connected to more deeper structures, if you look at that red kind of connection. So the point of this is just to show you how many different types of connections and how complicated those connections can quickly become.